Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and welcome to From the Rabbi's Bookshelves. This is the second in a three-part series about the major theological and philosophical writings of Rabbi Joseph B Soloveitchik. As I mentioned last week, he came from a very traditional background of Lithuanian yeshiva orthodoxy, but then he went first to Warsaw and then to Berlin, and he immersed himself totally in philosophical study. And that study led, amongst other things, to the publication of this volume, the Halakhic Mind. But its publication was very much delayed. He wrote it in the 1940s. It was completed by 1944, but it was only published in 1986. One of the last things was published while Rabbi Soloveitchik was still active before he went into retirement due to Parkinson's disease. This is an immensely difficult work because the first two or three parts are really rooted in very complex philosophy and epistemology and draw deeply on his technical studies while he was in Berlin. But the latter part of the book is much more accessible, and I want to read you some of that latter part. But first, some background. In this volume, Rabbi Soloveitchik understands the halakha, Jewish law as applied today, in this way. It is, as it were, a form of making our values concrete. So we have certain ethical and moral values. How are they made concrete? How are they made practical? By expressing them in the halakha. Halakha is the practical expression of abstract values or moral positions. And therefore, if you want to understand the moral position that Judaism has about a particular issue, or indeed its theoretical application of any concept, then you have to look at the halakha. And you work back from the halakha. You take the concrete form of the halakha and you reverse engineer it. And that tells you what Judaism's position is on a particular moral or other intellectual or theological question. And that's what he expresses in this paragraph, as we'll see. So he says as follows: despite its shortcomings, the retrospective procedure, that is to say, working backwards from the halakha towards the value that underlies it, still remains the only method to be pursued by the homo religiosus, that is to say, the religious person. If you as a religious person want to know what God views a certain moral issue as being right or wrong, good or bad, you take the halakha and you work backwards from that. If he is indeed bent on describing the religious act, this religious person must perform this retrospective analysis. If the philosophy of religion asks, for example, how the homo religiosus interprets the concepts of time, space, causality, substance, ego, etc., then it would have to look into the objective series and examine norms, beliefs, articles of faith, religious texts, etc. Out of this objectified material, the philosopher of religion may glean some hints regarding the structure of the most basic religious cognitive concepts. The objective act alone may serve as a point of departure for the philosopher desirous of interpreting the religious experience. Now, the context of this statement and this argument is, of course, an abandonment of halakha, an abandonment of Jewish religious practice in Europe and America and elsewhere in the modern age. Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying, you cannot possibly understand what God wants of you and the moral position God requires of you by working from any other starting point than the halakha. The halakha, Jewish law, Jewish life as it is lived, is the only way you can work out what God wants of you and what God wants you to think and to believe. There can be no Jewish religious life without the halakha, because that is the objective key to working out what God believes you should believe, believes you should do, believes you should think about all moral and other intellectual and theological matters. So it's a robust defense of the halakha and a guide and a toolkit for working out from the halakha what God wants of us in our lives. Thanks for joining.